Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to talk on emerging oil countries in West Africa and how they are making efforts to turn what we call the case of oil into sustained and inclusive development for their people. Ghana, as some of you may already know, discovered oil and gas in commercial quantities in 2007, but production actually started by the end of 2010. And to date, just a month ago, the Jubilee partners produced the 100 million barrel of oil, which was celebrated in some parts of the country. The levels of revenues we are getting today from oil is not that significant compared to what is happening in Nigeria, in Angola, in Equatorial Guinea, $444 million in 2011, $541 million in 2012, $700 million in 2013. And so there are modest levels of revenues attributed to the modest levels of production the country is making at the moment. But oil is significant in Ghana in spite of these modest levels of revenues for some reasons. Number one, Ghana attained the status of a net exporter of oil last year. We exported about $3 billion worth of oil and imported $2.7 billion worth of oil. And so even though modest levels of production, our country is a small country, a small economy, we are already a net exporter of oil. We also received the third largest amount of foreign direct investment in Africa, following South Africa and Nigeria. And most of the investments went to the oil and gas sector. So even though it doesn't contribute directly to the economy because of the poor linkages between the oil and gas industry as an enclave industry and the rest of the economy, we can see in terms of the size of foreign direct investment, the oil sector contributing significantly. And also as a result of oil production, Ghana got its highest growth rate in history, 13% growth rate in 2011. And so it's significant in many ways. We will see as we go along some of the dangers that are associated with oil in Ghana. But around Ghana, there are countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone who are showing greater promise as far as oil exploration is concerned. And there is so much hope that these countries will also, sooner than later, join the League of Oil-Producing countries in our region. But as frontier countries, all of them are emerging. There are some challenges, such as contract negotiation challenges, capturing and collecting the oil rent, and also investing the oil rent efficiently. These are serious challenges that we will see as we go along. Because if you are not able to address these challenges, there is no way you can avoid the case of oil. And so in these emerging producer countries in West Africa, there are policy options that they are confronted with on how they can avoid the case of oil. You know, exploration policy is one, and so they were looking at the licensing policy, whether competitive bidding or direct negotiation. We're looking at the fiscal contributions, and by fiscal contributions, whether we want to maximize our revenues or we want to use our fiscal policy or fiscal regime to attract investment upstream. We're also concerned about revenue management policy, and here, how to collect the rent, because you all know the capacity challenges in resource-rich countries, especially in Africa, on how effectively they can capture and collect the rent, but also how to invest efficiently the rent that is collected. And then we have social and environmental policy. And so these are the policy options confronting Ghana, but also Liberia and Sierra Leone as frontier nations. If we are able to get these policies right, I'm very sure we can avoid the case of oil. If we are not, we will join the league of countries that have become victims of the case already. But looking at the licensing regime, to begin with, the licensing regime is so important in the development of the industry. And Lisa talked about the need to adopt open and competitive bidding. But, the licensing regime goes beyond the open and competitive bidding. It's a comprehensive array of transparency frameworks that are required along the value chain, the entire contracting value chain. For instance, it requires the process for contracting of oil blocks to be open but also competitive so that the state can maximize benefits. It also requires contract disclosure to be mandatory, unlike what we have in Ghana today, where the minister decides which contracts to publish and which ones not to publish. It requires, again, the disclosure of the products of a contract. I'm talking about the production volume, I'm talking about sales price, revenues. They all need to be published as part of executing the contract commitment. Information on beneficial ownership must also be disclosed, and this is one of the new standards of the EITI. Then we also need the National Oil Company to be transparent and publish its annual financial reports and subject its investment to scrutiny, parliamentary scrutiny, but also scrutiny by the public. It must be allowed to make public comments on contracts. In Ghana, contracts are initiated by the government, taken to parliament. The citizens are not informed about the process, and because of the potential collusion we have in parliament, these contracts are almost always rushed through. And so citizens only wake up one day and read from the news that a contract has been approved by parliament. But as to what it entails, citizens are not told. Their views are not even invited. Relative to what happens in Brazil, where public hearings are held so that citizens can express their comments as to the deals that the government is signing. Now, this is the process in Ghana for awarding contracts, and you can see it's an administrative process. The minister receives the application. The minister sends it to the Petroleum Commission to evaluate the technical and financial capacity of the company. Then it comes back to the minister, who set up a negotiation team comprising of these organizations, 4 organizations, to negotiate with the company. Then goes back to the minister, who puts it before cabinet and then to parliament. This is an administrative process, and one may argue that the fact that it goes through parliament makes the process open. Unfortunately, it doesn't. Even parliamentarians who have risen on the floor of parliament to ask questions about beneficial owners of some of the contracts they have approved have been shut down. The Speaker of Parliament in Ghana is on record to have stopped debate on 2 contracts which were eventually approved in Parliament. And so the fact that it goes through parliamentary ratification doesn't guarantee the transparency that we need around contracting. And so, in summary, this is the situation in Ghana. Ghana has been cited in most, around the world as one of the most transparent regimes that is deepening governance around the oil and gas sector. Unfortunately, a critical look at the oil and gas industry in Ghana does not support the praises that are showered on Ghana so far. For instance, there is no open tendering process, and as I said earlier, concessions are awarded through an administrative process. There is no mandatory contract disclosure requirement in Ghana. There is no requirement for the disclosure of beneficial ownership information in Ghana. We have extensive confidentiality clauses in our contracts. And then, as I said, there is no requirement for public comments on contracts. But it is important to state that as a result of the advocacy around transparency and open contracting in Ghana, the government is developing a new petroleum law which seeks to address the gaps in our licensing regime. Unfortunately, as we will see, that also amounts to window dressing, because in Section 10.1 of the new bill, it makes provision for open and competitive bidding, but which is undermined by 2 other sections, Section 10.2 and Section 10.4. Because Section 10.2 gives the minister the power to ignore the outcome of an open and competitive process and to go and do direct negotiation. And in doing this, the minister is not required to publish reasons why he is moving away from the competitive bidding process. The 10.4 also gives the minister power not to even start an open and competitive process, to go direct negotiation But what the law says is that if the minister, in his opinion, thinks that the most efficient way of exploiting the resource is by direct negotiation. Okay, so these two provisions undermine Section 10(1), which calls for open and competitive bidding process. Now, we see examples in other countries, such as Sierra Leone, where the minister is required to give reasons through a public notice to the citizens why the minister wants to ignore the outcome of an open and competitive process. So if it is not happening in Ghana, then to some extent, Ghana will need to emulate the example of the Sierra Leone, because this meets the requirement of the new EITI standard. In Liberia, their EITI regime requires mandatory contract disclosure. In Ghana, as I said, we don't have requirement for mandatory contract disclosure. And so even though Ghana is being praised everywhere, our neighbors, Sierra Leone and Liberia, have some good examples that Ghana will have to emulate if we want to deepen the governance of licensing in our country. Outside West Africa, there are also good examples. In the situation where in Ghana, the minister can go direct negotiation if he thinks it is the most efficient way of exploiting the resource. If you compare that to what is going on in Angola, even though Angola has been associated with secrecy, opacity in their industry, since 2004, they have made significant efforts at deepening governance around the oil and gas sector. And one of the results is the law they passed in 2004, the petroleum law. And in that law, a minister can only do direct negotiation if the minister receives an application and within 14 days after publishing the notice of the application, no other entity expresses interest in that block. But if any entity expresses interest in that block, the minister is not required to do direct negotiation. The minister is required to open the bid for other companies to come in. I think this is a better provision than the efficiency criteria which the minister in Ghana is allowed to adopt in doing direct negotiation. Also, outside West Africa is South Sudan, the newest country in the world. And they have a very key oil sector production, revenue, and expenditure data, petroleum agreements, and licenses. Perhaps this is where the framework in South Sudan is better, or is an improvement over the EITI, even with the new standards, because the EITI doesn't comprehensively treat expenditure transparency. But as you can see, in South Sudan, their law requires expenditure transparency as well as the revenue transparency. Also, the minister must publish justification of award of petroleum agreements and also the beneficial ownership information of the contractor. And so Ghana has some more to do as far as the governance of natural resources are concerned. Now, the second issue I'd like to look at is fiscal contribution. And it is important to recognize that in these emerging countries, the debate going on is whether to increase revenues or attract investment upstream. That is the debate going on there. And so if you look at some of the contracts Ghana signed or Sierra Leone signed, because the risk profile was very high, because our areas were relatively unknown, the terms that were offered the oil companies were super attractive terms. But in the case of Ghana, following production of oil, we have seen a progressive move towards higher fiscal terms. And that marks the difference between an unknown area and a known area. And so look at the case of corporate taxes between frontier countries and mature countries. Okay, the frontier countries like Ghana, Ivory Coast, Uganda, they are charging lower corporate taxes compared to the mature countries. And therefore, the indication here is that as they also mature and the risk profile is reduced, they will have to consider revenue capture objectives as opposed to investment attraction. We also can look at the average state participation, and you can see the frontier countries taking lesser state participation. Then we can look at the government take generally, and this is the net fiscal benefits to the government. Again, the frontier countries are taking lesser government take than the mature countries. But as I was discussing with Lisa yesterday, is there need for fiscal benchmarking? Because it is not enough to say that the government take in Gabon is higher than the government take in Equatorial Guinea, because the conditions in these countries may be different in terms of the geological prospectivity, in terms of the stage of development in those areas, okay, in terms of the data, the level of knowledge of the area which is being explored. And so we may have to begin to talk about fiscal benchmarking. What do we think is the optimal level that an average country, with similar countries, like that country, what do we think is the net fiscal benefits that they should be getting from the extraction of their resources? Now, the resource tax dilemma. Otu and Co. states in a World Bank research that in matters of mining taxation, governments rarely believe that companies pay too much tax. Companies rarely believe that they pay too little tax. And citizens rarely believe that they actually see tangible benefits from the taxes that are paid. That is the dilemma. And so how do we ensure that we balance this interest, the interest of the companies, the interest of the government, and that of the citizens? In Ghana, for instance, there is a hue and cry about how much we are getting from oil. But it's not just in Ghana. In many other countries that have gone through Ghana's experience, at some point, their citizens had to put pressure on them to move away from the investment attraction objective to revenue capture objective. And different instruments and mechanisms were used by these countries. Changes in legislation, such as Ghana is doing. If you see the new law we are passing, it proposes fiscal reforms that are, of course, higher than what we have in our old law. Nigeria's petroleum industry bill has similar provisions, and Liberia as well. Some are using the bid system, others are creating higher level of state participation, and others are introducing new taxes. Ghana doesn't have capital gain tax in the oil and gas sector, but in the new law, we are introducing the capital. So this is in response to the cry by citizens for the country to move away from the investment objective to the revenue capture objective. But that is dangerous, because in Ghana, where only 20% of our hydrocarbon basins are licensed, you need to be able to attract investment. So balancing your investment objective with your revenue capture objective, I think, is the surest way to go. And this is why some countries have what we call additional oil entitlement or windfall taxes, which ensure that they capture more of the revenues as profit increases. Now, the next issue I'd like to look at is how do we then turn the revenues into long-term sustainable development? And this is by Robert Solow, that someone must always be taking the long view. They must somehow notice in advance that the resource economy is moving along a long path that is bound to end in disequilibrium of some extreme kind. If they do notice and take defensive actions, they will help steer the economy from the wrong path toward the right one. This is about how to invest our revenues efficiently to contribute to medium to long-term development of the country. And here again, there are policy options. While some countries are concerned about consuming, others are concerned about using their revenues to build the capital stock. There are others who are also concerned about saving in financial instruments in order to meet intergenerational equity considerations. And so there are various options that are open to different countries. In Ghana and Sierra Leone and Liberia, their laws are pursuing all these three objectives at the same time. Because apart from spending part of the money that is coming from this resource in the budget, they also have stabilization fund, which is to be used to stabilize the budget against fluctuations in crude oil prices, but also Future Generations Fund. In Ghana, we call that Heritage Fund, which is not to be spent until the oil and gas resources are depleted. But some challenges and pitfalls, largely three of them: capacity to negotiate oil contracts, capacity to collect oil revenues, and capacity to spend efficiently. Now, in terms of contract negotiation, what is happening in Ghana is so worrying. Ghana is giving many contracts to companies without experience, to companies that do not have financial base. But what is happening is that politicians and the friends of the politicians are rather using these companies to enter the industry. Our law requires local participation. And so most of the companies that are coming into Ghana are from Nigeria, who are ready to give 20% stakeholding to a Ghanaian firm, 30% stakeholding to a Ghanaian firm. But these companies go and borrow and carry over the local firms without the local firms making any financial commitment. And so eventually, once discovery is made, they call on the Ghanaian counterparts to sell. And today, this is what has happened to the Jubilee Fields. The Jubilee Fields started with 2 Ghanaian firms. After discovery, the 2 Ghanaian firms were asked to sell. EO Group sold to Talo Oil, and then Sabre sold to Petro SA. So to date, we don't have Ghanaian participation in the producing Jubilee Field in Ghana. And these are mistakes that we are repeating by giving oil contracts to Minos. In terms of negotiation, again, Ghana negotiated a contract with Kamak Energy, a Houston-based company, and these were the fiscal regime. This was celebrated in Parliament. After Parliament approved the contract, they were all over on air, on TV, on radio, celebrating this contract, that it made significant fiscal contributions over previous contracts, which was true. What Ghana did not do was to evaluate the contracts awarded to the same company in different countries, frontier countries like Ghana's. And so my center did an analysis of a contract given to the same company in Kenya in 2012. Now, the difference between the block in Ghana and the block in Kenya is that the block in Ghana is relatively known. It was relinquished by Talo Oil, and there is significant data already acquired on that block. And so the risk levels are lower. But capacity to collect revenues. In Ghana, we have difficulties collecting or even assessing the tax liability of the oil companies. The oil companies are allowed to do self-assessment, and the government just takes what they do without any special audit. And so the effect is that in 2011, when the government projected to receive $402 million, as was captured in the budget, we received nothing. In 2012, when we were expected to receive $239 million, we received nothing. So our capacity to collect is a problem. Finally, our capacity to spend efficiently. We received $700 million in 2013. Now, we have done a study at our center which indicates that if we were to spend this money on roads, school blocks, tractors, and fertilizers, if we were to spend the money on these projects, we will be able to get 800 kilometers of asphalt road, assuming 40% of that money was spent. 20% on school blocks should give us 4,000 school blocks. We have 3,000 schools under trees. And if we spend 20% of the money we got for 2013, we should be able to wipe out all the schools under trees with some surplus. If we spend 20% of that on tractors, we should be able to get 20 tractors for farmers. And that would have increased the farmer-tractor ratio by about that will reduce it by about 30%. If we spend it on fertilizer, 20%, we should be able to supply 6 million bags of fertilizer. And that will increase fertilizer use by 4,000%. But what did we do? We rather decided to spread the money thinly across so many thousands of projects. For instance, 48 million Ghana cedis, which is $28 million at the time, was spread over 63 road projects, covering 2,114 kilometers. And so the average allocation per kilometer was $11,000 against the official cost of a kilometer of asphalt of $370,000. And so granted that we maintain this rate of disbursement, it would take each of these projects not less than 30 years to complete. And this doesn't amount to efficient spending of the oil money. We are spending the oil money in the office of the president, when we should be investing this money in education, in roads infrastructure. We should invest it in tractors and fertilizer. So this is how we are spreading. So small, but how many? 16 ministries got the money in 2011, in 2012. 15 ministries got the oil money in 2015. In 2013, we made so much noise and the minister reduced it to 6 ministries. But you take each ministry, the allocation given to them was also then spread thinly across so many projects. And so the effect is that most of these projects suffer cost overruns and time overruns. And therefore, Ghana doesn't drive value for money in the use of oil revenues. And so, in conclusion, these resource-rich countries, the emerging countries, can avoid the curse of oil. However, it is too early to say that they are already experiencing the curse, but they can get it. And what, in my view, can fast-track their move towards the curse are two factors which they are currently experiencing. The first one is the governance curse, because Ghana, Sierra Leone, and Liberia are all associated with poor institutional quality. Ghana is somehow better, but there are serious challenges. Poor regulatory environment, increasing vested interest, weak parliament, wrong investment decision, corruption, and so on and so forth. And so, yes, it is possible to avoid the curse of oil, but we have to address the institutional, regulatory, and public financial management systems in our country to ensure that we translate the resources, these non-renewable resources, into tangible development outcomes for our people. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Emerging, there are some challenges, such as contract negotiation challenges, capturing and collecting the oil rent, and also investing the oil rent efficiently. These are serious challenges that we will see as we go along. Because if you are not able to address these challenges, there is no way you can avoid the curse of oil. And so in these emerging producer countries in West Africa, there are policy options that they are confronted with on how they can avoid the curse of oil. You know, exploration policy is one, and so they were looking at the licensing policy, whether competitive bidding or direct negotiation. We're looking at the fiscal in some parts of the country. The levels of revenues we are getting today from oil is not that significant compared to what is happening in Nigeria, in Angola, in Equatorial Guinea. $444 million in 2011, $541 million in 2012, $700 million in 2013. And so there are modest levels of revenues attributed to the modest levels of production the country is making at the moment. But oil is significant in Ghana in spite of these modest levels of revenues for some reasons. Number one, Ghana attained the status of a net exporter of oil, foreign direct investment, the oil sector contributing significantly. And also as a result of oil production, Ghana got its highest growth rate in history, 13% growth rate in 2011. And so it's significant in many ways. We will see as we go along some of the dangers that are associated with oil in Ghana. But around Ghana, there are countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone who are showing greater promise as far as oil exploration is concerned. And there is so much hope that these countries will also, sooner than later, join the League of Oil-Producing countries in our region. But as frontier countries, all of them, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to talk on emerging oil countries in West Africa and how they are making efforts to turn what we call the curse of oil into sustained and inclusive development for their people. Ghana, as some of you may already know, discovered oil and gas in commercial quantities in 2007, but production actually started by the end of 2010. And to date, just a month ago, the Jubilee partners produced the 100th million barrel of oil, which was celebrated last year. We exported about $3 billion worth of oil and imported $2.7 billion worth of oil. And so even though modest levels of production, our country is a small country, a small economy, we are already a net exporter of oil. We also received the third largest amount of foreign direct investment in Africa, following South Africa and Nigeria. And most of the investments went to the oil and gas sector. So even though it doesn't contribute directly to the economy because of the poor linkages between the oil and gas industry as an enclave industry and the rest of the economy, we can see in terms of the size of